This is probably the largest security vulnerability in Next.js's history. It's an authorization bypass rated at 9.1 out of 10, so critical severity, and it has certainly stirred up some controversy as a response, with both the Cloudflare and Replit CEO making some anti-Next.js and Vercel tweets. Let's take a look at what happened, as it was a little bit of a silly vulnerability to be honest, and whether it's actually a big deal. I'll start by showing you the exploit. It's an authorization bypass in Next.js's middleware. So if you had some authentication check in your middleware to protect a route of your app, you may have been vulnerable. As you can see here, I have a very basic middleware. I have is-authenticated, which just checks for the value of an auth token cookie. Obviously in the real world, this would be a lot more sophisticated and whatever authentication option you're using. Then if the user isn't authenticated and we want to go to the root/protected, we go ahead and just redirect them to the login page. So using this middleware, there should be no way that someone can get to the protected route. Let's put that to the test then. As you can see in my application here, if I try and go to /protected, I get taken straight to the login page. So my middleware is working. If I then log in, we can test if the middleware works. As you can see, we get to our protected route right after Chrome warns me that password isn't a safe password. Who knew? But as you can see, this page should be protected by the middleware, which we just saw that it is. And on this page, it is worth noting that I have an unprotected API response. So we're getting some data back here. Basically, on the page itself, I'm making an API call, but in the API itself, I'm not performing an authentication check because I've already handled this in my middleware. Then down here, I also have a protected API response, where in the API itself, I also perform a further authentication check. You'll see why in a second. But if I go ahead and log out here, we can see how we could bypass that authentication check so I don't have to log in to view that protected route. All we need to do is send x-middleware-subrequest as a header with our next request. Then in the value, we just need middleware 5 times. So if we send this header in our next request and we go to our protected routes to /protected, you can see we get taken straight to it. It's actually skipped over the middleware. So that is an authorization bypass that we've just performed. So that's pretty bad, right? Well, yes and no. As you can see, we do get to the protected route and the unprotected API data has loaded in. So this is the call to an API where the API itself doesn't perform an authentication check. So if you do this, you are definitely vulnerable, but that's also really bad practice and you shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. If we look at our protected API, you can see that we didn't get the protected API data. It returned a failed to fetch user data. This is because the API also performs an authentication check, and since this bypass is just skipping over the middleware step, the API doesn't receive any authentication details, so won't respond with the data. So if you did this, you wouldn't have any data leak, but they would still be able to see the contents or the layout of the page that don't require any data. So if you have a very basic paywall or something, you may consider this quite bad. It is also just an incredibly simple bypass, so it's something that probably should have been caught. Let's take a look then at why one simple header is able to bypass all of your middleware. Well, on GitHub, we can actually view the code that Next.js is running each time middleware is called. As you can see, I'm in the code base for 15.2.2, as 15.2.3 has actually been patched. And then we're inside of this sandbox.ts file, and then inside of here, I'm looking at a run function. In here, we actually have a check for our x-middleware-subrequest, and then it gets the value of that header that we have and splits it into an array based on the colon. So if you remember earlier, we sent through middleware 5 times separated by that colon. Now, Next.js's intent of this header was to prevent recursive requests from triggering infinite loops. For example, say our middleware had to make an API call that was also behind the middleware would actually start to run recursively. So this header stops that and skips the middleware entirely. So imagine in our bypass, this array is now middleware 5 times. We then have a max recursion depth step, and this is the part where we actually end up bypassing it. This depth step is a reduce, and as you can see inside of here, all it does is it checks if the value in our array is equal to params.name. Now, all params.name has to be in modern Next.js is where the middleware is placed, which is either going to be middleware or source/middleware if they're using the source folder. So in our case of the bypass, we have middleware 5 times, which means our depth here is now going to equal to 5. When it's equal to 5, we do if the depth is greater or equal to the max recursion depth, which in our case it is, it simply goes ahead and returns, and it does a response, and this is essentially going to the next step. It's skipping over all of the middleware functions that we have down here. Knowing how the bypass works then, how has this been patched? Well, taking a look at the CVE here, as you can see, it's a critical severity. It's actually rated 9.1 out of 10. If we go down to the patches, this has been fixed in version 15.2.3, as well as a patch for 14, and I believe they've also gone back to 13 and 12 now and updated that. The other workaround, though, was to go ahead and simply block the x-middleware-subrequest header from reaching your Next.js application. Now, if you're hosting on Vercel, they've actually already gone ahead and fixed this for you. The same with Netlify, and Cloudflare also offers you a managed firewall rule that can go ahead and fix this, or you can set one up yourself. And if you want to know how they've patched this, well, this is the PR request that fixed it. And it's this line of code here that stops the bypass. As you can see, it checks for an x-middleware-subrequest ID, which is new. Essentially, the server generates its own random ID that only the server knows. So now if you send through the header of x-middleware-subrequest and it doesn't have this ID, it will just go ahead and simply delete that header, so you won't be able to perform the bypass. So do you think this has been blown out of proportion since you should have protected your API routes anyway? Or do you think this is something they should have caught? Some have actually been annoyed that in the announcement for this CVE, they included a line that said Vercel customers are protected thanks to firewall, arguing that Vercel are trying to spin this into a marketing move. One of the biggest voices of that was the Replit CEO, who said that they sat on this for a day, dishonestly tried to spin it into a marketing event, and silently changed the logs, and still haven't provided clarity. Guillermo, Vercel's CEO, and Replit's one here actually had an earlier back and forth where Replit complained that Next.js is made to run on Vercel, and Vercel responded essentially saying, well, you use Next.js self-hosted. The Cloudflare CEO then also tweeted, save money, get better performance, and work with a company that cares about security. To which Guillermo responded, flaming Cloudflare. He said that Cloudflare is responsible for one of the worst security disasters in internet history, and said that they tried to use that product and had non-stop incidents and had to move off. There we go. What do you think about the vulnerability and the drama? Let me know in the comments, subscribe, and as always, see you in the next one.